August 1980, I'm on holiday in Italy, and I hear on the radio that an occupation strike has started on the Baltic coast in Poland. And I thought, I've got to be there. So I took the train all the way up to Berlin, across to East Berlin, got a visa to go to Poland, telling the consul that I was working on the Polish resistance to the Nazis. And so on the visa form it said, purpose of visit, Polish resistance. And I then got to Warsaw, flew up to Gdańsk, and arrived at the Lenin shipyard in this extraordinary scene. The shipyard completely occupied. On the gates of the shipyard, large photographs of the Pope, national flags, flowers, Lech Wałęsa. And the gates opened, and I and the two other journalists who were with me marched down this reception line of workers in dark blue overalls, chanting Anglia, Brasilia, Austria, because they were greeting, it was as if I had brought the support of England to them. And I then stayed with them for the next 2 weeks of this absolutely extraordinary occupation strike, which was a workers' movement against a so-called workers' state, where they had mass and confession by priests in the occupied shipyard, whoever had a workers' movement with the Catholic Church, and it gave birth to the Solidarity movement, Solidarność. And for me that was an absolutely formative experience, and what was so wonderful about it was that it was the cause of freedom and the cause of Europe marching together. And ever since, my happiest moments in Europe have been when freedom and Europe have gone together in the transitions to democracy in Eastern Europe or Southern Europe, and the unhappiest when it's been the opposite. Well, there was a West European narrative which was about 1992, which was about heading to the single market and possibly beyond that to the currency union. But for my friends behind the Iron Curtain, Europe meant something else. It meant what it also meant to young Portuguese or Spaniards in the early 70s. It meant all good things. It meant freedom, it meant democracy, it meant prosperity, it meant ability to travel, it meant respect in the rest of the world. All these good things were bundled up in the notion of Europe. There was actually a dictionary, a sort of comic dictionary in a Samizdat journal, and the entries for Europe said, if we go into a restaurant and there's a clean white tablecloth, and it actually has some of the food that it says it has on the menu, we say Europe. So Europe was all these good things together. And of course what happens after 1989 is that these two Europes, the real existing Europe of the European community, of the single market, and the Europe of East European dreams and South European dreams come together. I mean, I used to say at the time that Europe was divided into two halves, those who in the West who have Europe and those in the East who believe in it. And I think the narratives were different. In Western Europe it was increasingly a top-down narrative by political leaders, also by people in Brussels, telling the story, the success story of the European community, moving towards ever closer union. From the other side of the Iron Curtain, of course, the governments, the authorities were denying that, and so it was a popular bottom-up narrative in which people passionately believed. And maybe there's a lesson in that the real passion of Europeanism comes where people don't yet have it. Well, I think what happens is, broadly speaking, and obviously this is complicated, that in the 1990s and early 2000s, with the great enlargement of the European Union, the two converge into what in English we would call a Whig interpretation of history, a story of history as magnificent progress. And the high point of that is around 2004, 2005, before the Dutch and French referendums on the European Constitution. And at that moment, I mean, as I've written elsewhere, you know, if I died at that point, I would have gone to my death a happy European, because it really seemed to have come to fruition. As you know, what then happens is that it's increasingly engulfed in crisis, starting with the rejection of the Constitution, then with the financial crisis that rapidly becomes the Eurozone crisis, then with the advent of populisms of different kind and Putin's attack on Ukraine. And then you get a much more contested narrative that we still have today. I think it's a period of hot contestation, and you know, I think there are multiple narratives that work, which is why I'm very cautious about using the vocabulary of pro-European and anti-European, because of course Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini and others say they're also pro-European, they just want a different Europe. But basically, they have quite a clear narrative of going back to a Europe of nations, to bringing back more powers to the nation state, traditional values, community, family, the church, a Europe that puts up its barriers also to preserve its traditional culture, its self-defined, if you will, white Christian, they would say Judeo-Christian and Greco-Roman culture, and the other narrative, more liberal, more internationalist, more cosmopolitan, which is still the establishment narrative of the European Union, but has lost a lot of its force, and as we've already seen in this project, doesn't convince all that many people. Even those people who are in principle in favour of the European Union, it doesn't speak to them, and it certainly doesn't speak to their hearts anymore.